Welcome back to Nate the Hate, where you can find us on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcast. And I am joined by my co-host, the Australian Thunder from Down Under, MVG.
What's up, Nate? Great to be here.
Always great to have you. And today we have a special guest, the tech analyst wizard himself, John Linneman from Digital Foundry. Welcome, John.
Greetings, gentlemen. It's good to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. It's definitely an honor to have you join us. And today we're going to talk about Phil Spencer's recent comment about the Xbox Series X, where he compared this upcoming generation to the shift we saw from 2D to 3D gaming. And I'll read his exact tweet. He said, "Ray tracing on console will be great. I'm very focused on the work we are doing around dynamic latency input. In my view, the feel of games this upcoming generation will change as dramatically as any since 2D to 3D, given CPU upgrade, DLI, memory bandwidth, and SSD." Now, what was your first take when you saw this tweet, John?
So, there's different ways to look at this. First of all, there's the visual side, right? Obviously 2D to 3D was a gameplay shift as well as a visual shift. And, arguably you could say ray tracing being kind of like the holy grail of rendering, that is kind of, that's a massive, massive jump. But I'm not sure that we're going to see, this is like the beginning of ray tracing, if you will. We're still in that phase. The RTX stuff's been around for a couple of years. Now we have the consoles. I think this is going to help make it kind of the big push. So in a way, it is almost kind of like, I could liken it to like the PlayStation, right? Or the Saturn, when you have the early generation of 3D. This is like the early generation of ray tracing. But fundamentally, I'm not sure that's not really comparable in terms of gameplay wise. But when you look at the big picture of what it could represent, like he mentions DLI, for instance, and I think they're putting a lot of effort into reducing input latency as much as possible and help developers sort of reduce that inherent latency that a lot of engines exhibit. And when you combine this with modern television shipping that have much, much lower input latency than TVs from, say, a decade ago, it does kind of feel like they're pushing back towards games that are more responsive. Like, I don't know if we'll get back to CRT quality response times here, but it's kind of heading in that direction. I feel like the generation of PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 especially was really, really bad for input latency. The frame rates were low, games were very laggy, things didn't feel great for the most part. And this generation has improved, but there's still room to grow. And I feel like the combination of much faster input with ray tracing, those are very big things. But whether it's like 2D to 3D, that's kind of debatable.
So latency is the time it takes for the data to come from the control of the input device to the screen, right? So remember when Stadia came out, they were talking about that negative latency thing where they kind of predicted your input movements and stuff, which ended up being kind of, it's something that's been around for a while. Stadia's marketing thing was terrible, but that kind of concept has been around. I guess my question is, outside of, these big buzzwords, how does this thing actually work? And I think that's the part for me that I want to learn more about. It sounds really cool, and that they're working with TV manufacturers on getting that level of latency down, or that lag down. I think that's awesome they're doing that. But I also question how practical this will be when it actually does, finally appear on the Series X.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I don't know if we actually have all the technical details on that, but it could be something like, the whatever it's called, the run back or whatever they use in certain emulators.
Yep.
Where I think the idea, though, is to transmit input to the console, they say specifically just before the game asks for it. So there's that bit of like prediction element to it. But, you could see something like, say, you send the input, it's processing the frame, and it might like send the information to the GPU at an earlier point in the rendering time, for instance. You know what I mean? So it's like it's just changing the order of when it's sending commands off to the GPU and CPU and everything and shuffling that around, maybe. But it sounds like this is actually a very specific thing within the console. But yeah, you're right. I don't know all the details on technically how it works at this point, at the low level.
Yeah.
Because you're right. The way they describe it, it sounds like it's supposed to be something that's sort of universal, right? Like
Right.
and it's something kind of embedded into the controller, I think, as well.
Yeah.
So it's like it's part of the new controller design. So maybe it has to do with the actual, the controller board within the controller itself and the way it transmits data back and forth to the console.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, we've been told that you can bring your old controllers forward to the Series X, which is great. I love that feature that they're offering, but do you get that functionality, or do you have to have a Series X controller to get the DLI? I think that will remain to be seen as we find out more about the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I want to see if either one of you agree with me. Well, when I saw his statement, my first thought was that it was hyperbole, because we've seen high frame rates on PC, we've seen low latency, we've had SSD on PC for a while, and it sounds like he's just kind of he's using the buzzwords to get console gamers excited about the Xbox Series X and what next gen's going to offer. But like, as I said, these are features we've seen on PC, like ray tracing, as you mentioned, John. It's still early, and now we'll actually see it utilized to a greater extent on these next gen systems. But as you kind of compared it to like early 3D, like we saw on the Saturn and even PlayStation, so would you say it's fair to call his statement hyperbole, or do you think that's off base?
Well, when you're examining things like that, like the 2D to 3D shift, if you're talking about on the console generation, it did kind of come later than 3D appeared well before that, right? And so
Right.
naturally, it's, arcade games, it was in certain PC games at the time, and that's the same here. We have these features already on the PC, although dynamic latency input, technically the way it's implemented does seem to be a specific hardware function. But obviously, the PC, there are ways to deal with this and reduce your latency. But we haven't seen, I would say we haven't seen a significant uptake in terms of ray traced games at this moment. There are some very impressive examples of it, but it is not something common in every release, right? There's just those high profile titles, games like Control, Metro Exodus, and whatnot. And I think that just comes in part due to the fact that this feature is really only usable right now on an expensive RTX card, right? Which a lot of people do not have. So by implementing the feature in consoles, that is good for ray tracing in general, as it just means that there will be more hardware which can utilize these features. So it sort of encourages more developers to jump in and introduce it, which in turn allows them to start doing more interesting things with it, which could lead to sort of this revolution in visual quality. And potentially, I don't know, gameplay, how this ties into the gameplay. There's definitely areas where this could affect that, but it's still kind of early to say on that side.
Yeah, so would you say, like when we sort of transitioned from 2D to 3D, how we saw like a paradigm shift in the way we interacted and played our games, instead of ray tracing being that equivalent, would you say the SSD would play the bigger role in the way we experience games moving into the next generation?
For me personally, yes, big time. That is the fundamental shift. Because, the bottleneck right now is you're moving data from a hard drive into memory in order to use it, and that takes time. And so obviously the games have to be built in a very specific way in order to best leverage that limitation. So that's always a bottleneck on current machines. And even on the PC, most PC games are not designed to take advantage of specific features that solid state drives can offer outside of something like Star Citizen, which, does not really work at all on a mechanical hard drive.
I agree, John. I think the SSD is probably the biggest advancements that we'll see next generation. Obviously, Sony is doubling down on it as well. They're putting a lot of emphasis on it. But Yeah, I mean, finally, with the speeds that we're hearing about now, it's true virtual memory. That concept of virtual memory where you've got your
Exactly.
hard drive and you're pulling assets off the hard drive. I mean, sure, that makes a lot of sense, but it was never really fast enough to really kind of handle just a constant flow of assets coming off the hard drive without some type of jittering or stuttering, especially if you weren't threading your code appropriately where it could pull assets off while the game was playing. Now it's fast enough where it truly is a bank of additional RAM or additional memory that you have access to, and I think that's quite exciting for games to come out, and I think we'll see some really cool things come out of that as the games start to show up.
Yeah, I feel like that's actually going back to where we left behind when the PlayStation Saturn and that launched. The switch to optical disc gave us significantly more space to work with, of course, but you lost that speed.
Yep.
Old cartridges were basically like, additional memory. Using memory mapped cartridges, you could directly access the data from the cart. You still had system memory for each of those consoles to work with, of course, the work RAM and whatnot. But it was super fast. And this is the first time I think we're actually getting back to that point, because the SSD drives here, it's not, the Switch, the DS, all those systems, Vita, they all use flash memory, right, as like sort of a storage mechanism, but it's not technically fast enough. It doesn't have the bandwidth to actually access it as if it were memory.
Mm-hmm.
So the move to SSD is basically return to the memory mapped cartridge days in a way. So I'm very curious to see what can be done with that.
Yeah.
So I think fundamentally it's going to shift the types of things that can be done. And we've not had a point where we're in this modern era of, engines and whatnot, where developers have had this kind of horsepower available to them.
For sure.
Just this bandwidth.
And Nate, not to plug my channel, but I did a recent video on Nintendo 64, and I read a quote from Factor 5, John, that you mentioned that kind of just remind me of it, that they said that when they were developing games on the N64, they were treating the cartridge like additional RAM, and that was kind of the way that they thought about developing the games, that they weren't really that limited by the 4 megabytes of RAM on the N64 because they had this cartridge, that was really their pool of memory that they were using.
Yeah, and that was a great video, by the way.
Appreciate it.
But yeah, no, that's the problem. Well, N64, like you said, has had such little memory to work with, especially things like the texture cache and whatnot. So
Yeah.
sort of like streaming data in and out, in real time from the cartridge worked well there.
Yeah, and I think we'll see games start to use that approach. I mean, games are doing that today. I mean, everything, especially open world games, things are being streamed constantly, but I think we'll see a lot more as far as dynamic games, with dynamic kind of environments as things kind of shift in and out. And I think that's really exciting. There's definitely going to be a change in the landscape as far as games that we start to see coming out next gen.
Imagine like the fidelity that you can do, like, in the sense that, like loading a lot of animation data, for instance, that requires a lot of bandwidth to pull it from the hard drive. So obviously right now, because they are streaming all the time, they sort of need to budget the type of data they're streaming and how much they're going to need for any scene, for instance. And now there's just you because you have access to so much so fast, you could kind of conceivably fetch anything you might need, allowing significantly more complex sequences. Like right now, I don't think we could see. You look at what Naughty Dog's done. You look at something like Uncharted 4, some of those incredibly complex animation sequences, and a lot of those very carefully designed things. Obviously, a lot of that is just careful talent poured into making sure the assets, the animations, everything's great. But you still need to load all that data, and trying to dump that kind of interactions into a massive open world game. I think it would be pretty difficult to do well, and I'm not sure we've really seen it. I mean, even productions like Red Dead Redemption 2, with its huge world, it doesn't have the finesse of something like that.
Right.
Not even close, really. So, I'm very curious to see what they can do on that side, and I think that is the big step forward.
Yeah, because like I'll use Final Fantasy VII Remake as a recent example, where you would go into town and you would try to interact with one of the characters, and you would have that, I'd say, what, about a 5 to 7 second buffer of where the game was trying to load and stream just a simple conversation and to bring up like the shop menu.
That
And
is such a weirdly egregious example of this, and I'm not really sure what's going on there, because we've seen plenty of games that don't struggle from these same issues. So it kind of seems like they had issues sort of managing what they're loading into memory, because it's constantly shuffling things around. You got the texture pop in, loading conversations, that kind of stuff. It's kind of bizarre, actually.
so yeah, hopefully, I mean, we all expect that Final Fantasy VII Remake will get a port to next gen consoles. It's Square, it's an easy money opportunity, and hopefully something like that is addressed in those versions, especially, they can take advantage of the SSD. I wouldn't expect them to go crazy with a next gen port of the first game, but especially like the sequel, we should see considerable improvement in the way the towns, the characters,
Definitely.
everything loads, and that's exciting. Like, I guess one of my questions for the SSD would be, how do you as Microsoft or Sony advertise it to the mass gaming community as this must have feature? Because going from 2D to 3D you saw it sold itself. How do you sell SSD streaming and all of this to the mass consumer?
Man,
So
that is a great question. I'm going to let John take that one, because that is a really good question. Because you're right, most people out there, they want to buy a console for Christmas for their kids. They want to play Madden, they want to play FIFA. They're not that interested in technical performance and specs like that. So yeah, I mean that's a great question.
I think it's going to be a case where it comes down to the end result, what happens within these games, and word of mouth. And I'll give you an example that I always kind of go to. Frame rate. You try to tell the masses about, oh, you need 60 frames per second, high frame rates, superior. Most people, they're not gonna understand what you're talking about or care. They'll just say, well, I don't understand. That's just the average person. That's not important to them. But if you look at a lot of the top selling, most successful games in the world right now, you'll find that most of them are actually 60 frames per second, right? It's very, very common. Not all, but there's a lot. And what I found is that if you talk to these people about these games, like something like Call of Duty, like Fortnite, they run at these frame rates, they will tell you that this game feels better than this other game that might be 30 frames per second. They don't know why, but they know that it does. There's something about that feel. The frame rate does actually improve the experience, which we all know. They don't know why it's better, they just know that it is better. And I feel like it's the same kind of thing we might see with what the SSD could bring to the table. You show people games that really showcase something maybe they haven't seen before, or something really amazing, or just deliver a really, really good experience, and I think they start to get it. But I don't know about just going out there and being like, yeah, we got this super fast drive, like you guys should buy our system for that. Like, it's not going to work for the casual audience, but it does work for the more hardcore audience. So that's why I think like marketing this stuff requires sort of a multi-pronged approach, where you've got to target different consumers in different areas. And yeah, so one message is not going to work for everyone.
Yeah, it kind of feels like ray tracing may be the term that they could use as, that marketing term to target more of the casual, kind of like we saw during like the Super NES era, where we had the what was the name of the
Mode
chip?
7.
Mode 7?
Yeah, Mode 7. Like they showed you Star Fox, and it's like, look how crazy this is. We're using this special technology.
Super FX.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, it's Super FX.
chip.
Like you say that, and people are like, "Oh, this is something new. It's exciting." It feels like ray tracing is kind of like that modern day Super FX, where they're going to show you the lighting, and they're going to show you this amazing visuals, and you're going to look at a Call of Duty trailer, and that's what's going to resonate with you from that visual standpoint of, this is amazing.
There's a weird thing though to consider with this, and it's something I've been thinking about. With ray tracing in these consoles, we kind of have a rough idea of how they compare with, say, the RTX series cards. At least
Mhm.
on the Xbox side, we don't really know much about PS5 there. But with these more capable CPUs, more powerful graphics cards, you're thinking, hey, we can do 60 frames per second games or higher more often.
Yep.
But then you add ray tracing into the mix, and suddenly that starts to, come into doubt, which makes me wonder if we'll see more games that use ray tracing then just go back and start targeting 30 FPS again, as is kind of the norm for a lots of certain games. Like I don't see
Yeah.
Call of Duty, for instance, going heavy on ray tracing outside of maybe. I guess the question is it fast enough to use certain features
Mhm.
of ray tracing at 60 frames per second? Like that is still up in the air, but I have a feeling that it's going to kind of be an either or. You're either doing ray tracing but at a lower frame rate, or you're not doing ray tracing and you're hitting 60 or higher.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a good point.
and I'm gonna push that a little further, Nate. I'm gonna ask. Okay, let's cut the BS, right? Let's look at Spencer's tweet again. Okay, so he said ray tracing on the console will be great, and then he shifts the conversation to something completely different, talking about DLI, 2D to 3D, CPU upgrades, memory bandwidth, SSD. Are we? Does that how do we kind of interpret this tweet? Is Spencer saying, yeah, we've got ray tracing, it's cool, but it's going to be cool in really small doses in very limited scenarios? And by the way, here's all the real cool stuff that we're doing on the Series X to kind of take the conversation away from ray tracing. Or do you think that it's just something that Spencer's kind of focusing more on at the moment?
You see, I think that's where they can still use ray tracing as that buzzword, even if it's only used by, let's say, 30% of its overall library. It's ray tracing, and when they want to showcase it and highlight it in a significant way, they will. But I guess going back to John's point, I mean, ray tracing is resource heavy. So it's not going to be utilized by everything, especially those games they want to push higher frames a second. So like I wouldn't expect to see ray tracing in the next like Forza Horizon game or even the next just mainline Forza game because that's that's a game you'd want to push those higher frame rates on, and you'll
I
still
mean,
target
they
the
could have
highest
an
resolution
option
you
though.
can.
Like
Yeah.
Forza Horizon 4 had this 60 frames per second mode on Xbox One X, which was 1080p, versus the 4K native mode, which is locked at 30. So, conceivably, I could see them doing something like here's the high end mode, here's the high frame rate mode.
True. So they could do, yeah, that's true. You could remove a ray tracing or the certain other features to do the higher performance mode, and then you have graphics mode, which we've seen a lot of Switch games use all of a sudden, where they give us those two options, performance versus graphics mode, mostly from THQ Nordic Games, which is surprising that they're the ones giving us options. But that's an interesting idea from Microsoft to really utilize in their games moving forward, because I mean these machines are going more towards a PC route where we're going to have more flexibility or options in the way we experience the games, because I mean yes, they're going to push 4K, they're going to push higher frame rates, but if they can still offer that, like, oh, maybe we'll do checkerboard, we're going to give you the higher frame rate with ray tracing. If that doesn't mean anything to you, maybe you don't have a monitor or a TV that's going to, you don't have a 4K monitor, so you're going to set your game to 1080 and you want full ray tracing and let's say hypothetically
Well,
120 frames a second. Could they offer all of these profiles in a single game?
I don't know if they'd go that far with it, but you mentioned checkerboard, and I actually think that a key thing for this generation is going to be things such as image reconstruction, temporal upscaling, stuff like variable rate shading, basically anything to reduce the load on the GPU, which could conceivably give more headroom to ray tracing functions. So a lot of that stuff's very effective. I mean, you guys have seen how good these reconstruction methods have become lately. It's very impressive what you're able to achieve, and stuff like we don't know that much about what they can do with machine learning on the Series X yet, but they do support DirectML.
Mhm.
And conceivably there could be something like a DLSS style imagery construction technique, right? Like DLSS 2.0 on the PC side is extremely impressive. If you're kind of rendering a 1080p image and you use DLSS 2.0 with it, you're basically hitting what looks to the eye kind of like an actual native 4K image, but at a fraction of the cost. I mean, obviously DLSS has a cost, but it is lower than just rendering natively. So I think if you combine all these elements together, maybe you start to get the headroom you need to introduce more ray tracing features without killing the frame rate. Maybe.
Yeah, so out of the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5, based on what we know, based on public information, which of the two would you say is better equipped to utilize ray tracing to a greater extent?
I don't think we can answer that yet, to be honest, because we just don't know enough about the PS5 side. I mean, on Xbox One X, or on Xbox Series X, I did actually get to play around with Minecraft, the ray tracing demo. So I saw that running on a real console and played with it. And that's the path tracer that they implemented in there. It's pretty demanding, right? You need a beefy PC to run that well. And it was running at 1080p with an uncapped frame rate. So it was sort of, I'd say, 40 to 60 frames per second, depending on what you're looking at, which doesn't sound amazing in terms of performance. But at the same time, this is such an expensive and complete use of ray tracing, or path tracing in this case, which is even more demanding, that, it kind of gives us a ballpark idea of where it's at. And it's pretty impressive, actually, I'd say. But yeah, PS5, no idea.
Yeah, I think we need to see more from Mr. Sony and the PlayStation 5 before we can kind of A/B test and provide accurate comparisons. But at the moment, yeah, I mean, you would say Microsoft only because, as we've mentioned in the past, Nate, that Microsoft have come out of the gate really quickly this time around, and they're kind of running the narrative at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I think once we see the PlayStation 5 in more detail, we'll definitely have a better idea.
Yep.
Yeah. And one thing I do have to say for Phil Spencer is I love the way he is handling this pre-launch of the Xbox Series X, especially when you compare it to the terrible job that Don Matrick did with the Xbox One X. Xbox One.
Man.
I mean, Spencer is in a completely different league here. He's like, they waited, they bided their time, where people were actually sitting there saying, what's going on with the next Xbox? Is like, have they even handed out dev kits? And then all of a sudden we get the reveal at the Game Awards, and since then Phil Spencer he's been aggressive. Yeah. He's one step ahead of Sony, it seems like, every turn, and every time Sony comes out with something, there's Microsoft with a response. And I mean, it seems like Microsoft is ready for a full turnaround, and I've said it before, but Microsoft feels very confident right now.
Very confident.
I mean, it's just going to be a question of, is their confidence well placed?
Yeah, I mean, that's we're going to have to wait and see on that. But, I think it's a great example of why competition matters.
Yeah. John, Nate and I joke around. I keep telling him that the console wars are back this generation, and he doesn't believe me, but I think the console wars are back for this. For sure.
Oh, they are completely back. And not only are they back, they might be more severe than they've ever been.
Could
really
be. The amount of excitement around these machines right now is insane. Like, I get it, but wow. Like,
I know, you see a PlayStation 5 logo gets, well, it's like 3 million likes on Instagram. Whoever thought that would happen? Especially since it was just a number swap.
Yeah, I mean, people are really, really passionate right now. And I would say especially on the PlayStation side, they are really passionate, very excited. Which kind of makes me think about the whole reveal strategy. They're taking two very different approaches, right? Like, Microsoft's been very upfront, rolling things out at a reasonable pace. You're learning a lot about the machine, but there is a little less mystery there, of course. So that's kind of good or bad. And Sony's taking the opposite approach, where they're sort of very slowly putting information out there, keeping things very quiet. Like you remember the original Wired articles last year, where it's
Yeah.
just like, you get the tease that, oh yeah, we're working on the next thing, and then the logo reveal, and then we had the reveal with Mark Cerny here. It's a very different strategy, and I'm curious to see how that pays off for them, because I do feel like they were a little more aggressive with PS4, because
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
February event they held for that was very, very strong. Like they showed a lot of stuff, and it was a ton of stuff that got people excited. And then when E3 came around, they sort of delivered the killing blow, so to speak. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what's going to happen this time, especially right now with, I'm sure some plans have changed as well.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like they're waiting to kind of sunset the PS4, get the last two games out of the summer, Ghost of Tsushima and The Last of Us Part 2, of course, and then I think the focus will shift to PS5 very quickly after that.
We can
Yeah,
hope.
We do
that is a
hope,
good
yes.
point. Although, I mean, The Last of Us for PlayStation 3 was released after the PlayStation 4 big reveal,
That
right?
is true.
So,
That is true.
and it's interesting that The Last of Us is once again in that position as a very, very late generation game. But thanks to Ghosts of Tsushima, it is no longer The Last of Us. That is the true Last of Us.
And it always seems Sony has one of their bigger first party titles launch close to their next gen hardware. Like we had The Last of Us launch close to the PS4. Then we had God of War 2 launch, I
Yeah.
think it was the month before the PlayStation 3. And the ironic part was those systems couldn't play those games.
The PS3 could.
PS3 could, you just didn't get. I remember some people were hoping you'd get like a benefit by playing it on a PS3, but like we didn't even see an HD version of God of War 2
No, that's true.
until when did they actually do those HD remasters of the God of
Oof,
War?
I don't remember the date, but it was
But it
several years
was,
into the
yeah,
PS3.
and it's weird that once again, I wonder if it's deliberate by Sony that they just want to end their current gen on a high note and then just transition into
I've
next
wondered
gen.
that. I mean, what about, say, they also released Gran Turismo 6
Yes.
after the PlayStation 4 had launched?
That's correct.
And arguably one of my favorite games on PlayStation 3 was
Absolutely.
Puppeteer, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
We-
yeah.
I remember that. And that launched just before PlayStation 4 as well, which kind of maybe sent it to die, even though it was not a big AAA release. But still, imagine if that had been a PS4 launch game. I feel like it
Especially
would have,
with the 3D support.
right? Like that would have been such an amazing PS4 launch game. It could have been double the frame rate even. Throw that up against Knack. Sorry, Knack. I mean, gotta go with Puppeteer on this one.
Ooh, man, yeah. Puppeteer as a launch game on PS4 with the 3D support, you would have had a better frame
Yeah.
rate. You would have had sharper resolution for 3D. That could have been a significant launch game at the time for the system instead of, Mark Cerny's Knack.
And you could still have Knack. It's, whatever. That's fine. It's just I think Puppeteer really would have been great as a launch title because it was sort of forgotten on PS3, but as a launch title for PS4, positive that could have been big. And I kind of feel the same about what's happening now. Like I think it's too late for something like Ghosts and The Last of Us, of course. But Cyberpunk launching in September, obviously originally targeting spring. How much more of an impact would that have had if that game launched alongside the new consoles? I mean, sure, you'd still have your last gen version, that's fine. But to have a souped up version on the new machines with improved visuals and new features, and I think that would have just the amount of consoles that would have moved, it would have made a huge difference. And it would still sell everywhere because it's a
Right.
popular game.
Well, that's the thing with Cyberpunk. They did say that if you buy it, the Xbox One version, and you put it in your Series X, you get some form of an upgrade. But I don't know if they specified if it would be on the Xbox Series X launch day or not.
I mean, did they actually say that it would be upgraded or that it would just work?
I would have to check their wording on that.
Because that's
Do
what
you
I'm
recall
wondering.
that, PG?
Yeah, I got to go back and check as well. It's an interesting point
I
because
mean, theoretically, it could run better. I mean, that's presuming there are performance issues in the launch version. Maybe just running it on an Xbox Series X would fix those problems. In that case,
so putting on my conspiracy theory hat on for a sec, do you think that they made the date September because they don't have exact information as to when new generation consoles are coming out, and so they couldn't really commit to anything because they didn't know?
I mean, targeting launch is obviously always a difficult proposition, so you kind of have to assume a time frame.
Yeah.
But I think I don't know. I kind of imagine that both Sony and Microsoft maybe still haven't figured out things like launch date or even price. Like I'm sure they have lots of potential options, but I could see a situation where the situation is still fluid. So they got to wait and see.
Mm-hmm.
But you could tell developers, we're going to target this time frame, so try to be ready by then. And but still, Cyberpunk's going to dominate September either way,
Yes.
and it
Yeah,
almost makes sense to do it GTA 5 style, where you release it
Oh,
on the last gen machines, and then hey, a year later, or even less, here's this super enhanced version.
Mm-hmm.
that's a good example right there. And I kind of wonder if Microsoft and Sony are definitely playing a game of cat and mouse when it comes to pricing and even launch date.
Yeah, for sure.
They just kind of sit there saying, okay, who's gonna blink first? And the problem is that Microsoft is in a position right now. They are the cat in this cat and mouse. They're waiting for Sony to scurry across the floor to make their move, and then they're gonna pounce. And both companies have to be aware of this because, I mean, there's no way Sony is sitting in their office saying, well, we're gonna get one up over Microsoft. Microsoft's sitting there saying, we know you're thinking that, whether it's in price or launch day.
See,
You think you're gonna beat us.
this is the part that I struggle with. Sony sold 100 million PlayStation 4s,
Yes.
and now we kind of are led to believe that they're waiting to see what Microsoft's doing. That part I struggle with. I'm not saying it's not true or it's not something that's happening, but I just how can you come away from the PS4 in such a commanding position and kind of be second guessing yourself coming into the next gen? That part really just doesn't make sense to me.
I hate to use this term, but it's been true in the past. I think Sony is shifting a little bit into their arrogant Sony
Oh,
mode.
there it is. I was waiting for that.
You mean from PS2 to PS3 all over again?
Yeah, I think they're kind of saying they're like, we had a huge success. And we also have to remember how many times Microsoft fell over their own feet due to the poor leadership of Don Matrick of the Xbox One, where they came out and said, you can't have used games. And Sony comes out at E3 and you had Adam Boyes hand the game to Yoshida saying, here. Like that was a coup de grace right there. It
Oh,
was,
yeah.
Microsoft can't recover their messaging. Microsoft's messaging has just been on point.
Yeah.
And I think when they came out at the Game Awards, they caught Sony off guard with a more powerful machine than Sony was expecting. And now Sony's kind of on, they backed a little bit like, okay, Microsoft is coming at us stronger than we thought. They're coming way more aggressive than we anticipated. How do we counter this?
So one interesting thing to consider, though, is that power is not the be all end all, right? If you look at the history of PlayStation, they were not always the most powerful. PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, they have their interesting strengths for sure, but there was competition that was more capable, I would say, in both of those cases, despite them becoming the market leader. And you also see this in the handheld space, like with the DS and the PSP or the 3DS and the Vita,
Yep.
where, the more powerful machine fell short. Although I would still say the PSP was a huge success. It just wasn't DS success.
Right.
And the Xbox One, I think, is the first time. I mean, it's only their third console, but it's the first of the three that launched that was actually a weaker machine. That's the first time that had happened because the Xbox brand was built specifically around power. And I'm not sure that was necessarily the case with the PlayStation. It just kind of happened that way with PS4. So And even now, the PS4 Pro is a less capable machine, but the launch situation is different since it came out a year earlier and everything. So I think even if I think Microsoft wants the power more than Sony, perhaps, if you know what I mean. It's like,
Yeah.
to them, it's very important for their brand, for their fans to have as much power as possible on the PS5. And I'm not saying one is more powerful than the other here at all.
Yep.
So for anybody listening, that is not what I'm saying here. I'm just saying I think it would be more acceptable on the Sony side to have a slightly less capable machine, because that's kind of how they've rolled in the past. And it has not hurt their output at all. I don't think power alone is why people have gone to PlayStation. I mean, that's definitely wasn't the case for me either. So,
Right. I mean, I guess you could say Sony has a more prestigious lineup of first-party software. They have their
oh yeah,
iconic franchises, whereas Microsoft still kind of just has, I guess you would say, Halo, Gears of War, and Forza, but neither of those like three really match the highs of the God of Wars, or even a more recent example of like Horizon Zero Dawn. Like that was a huge success for a new IP.
I want to see what they can do this, because they have purchased a lot of developers. And if you look back at the history of the
Yes.
Xbox, there were periods where they had a lot of first party published games that were really interesting and unique. And I mean, they even recruited in Japanese studios, like the Mistwalker games, for instance.
Yes.
Those were phenomenal.
Yeah, so
Microsoft was doing a lot of experimental stuff and working with great developers and publishing this stuff under the first party name. Some of it didn't pan out, but they were going for stuff like Too Human, for instance, at the time. Obviously, that didn't, we know what happened there. But I'm just saying, if you look at the history of that developer that they went with, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I think.
but I don't feel that they did that much at all this generation. It feels like after a certain point, they've just really leaned on third party, and then they were never able to get back to these killer, unique first party productions.
Yep.
Yeah, when you look at Microsoft during the pre Call of Duty 4 Xbox 360 days to post Call of Duty 4, it looks like a completely different company, because as you said, like they went to Japan and they courted Square Enix for Final Fantasy 11. They had Mistwalker with
That's
Blue
right.
Dragon and Lost Odyssey. They
They had
went
Bullet
to
Witch.
Namco. Yeah, Bullet Witch. They went to Namco to get Tales of Vesperia as a console exclusive.
Don't forget Atlas Cave with all those great shoot 'em ups from Japan, like Dodonpachi and all that stuff. I mean, all that
Like, yeah.
exclusive Japanese stuff.
I would
like
love
that
that
smile.
$1,000 cave shooter box.
I
saw
know.
one for sale recently, and I was like, I really want that, but no, I can't do it.
I've piecemealed most of the collection, John, but I don't have the box to go with it, unfortunately.
Oh man! But then there's you said Namco and Tales of Vesperia. Do you remember the canceled Frame City Killer from Namco?
No,
Don't remember Frame City Killer?
no, I don't.
Oh, guys, man, it was an Unreal Engine 3 like open world city game, like sort of a cyberpunk universe created by Namco, and it was supposed to be a 360 exclusive, but alas, it was canned.
What was the game on I think it was the Xbox that was canceled? True Fantasy Live?
True Fantasy Online.
Yeah,
Live,
yeah,
or
True
whatever,
Fantasy
yeah.
Online.
I remember that. I remember being excited for that game, and the release date, it was like, it's supposed to release in like a month. And then I'd go, to like IGN. This was like back in like, what was it, 2004? And like, Microsoft canceled the game. It's like, but it was supposed to come out in like 3 weeks. It's like, what happened there? But like, the Xbox era Microsoft, because they leaned so heavily
Yeah.
on themselves, they covered every genre back then. And they just became such a different company. But it seems like under Phil Spencer now, with these company acquisitions and his reach out to Japan in recent months, he really wants to have that diverse offering of software again. And we've seen the rumors of a brand new Fable, a new Perfect Dark, and they're finally embracing that catalog of IP that they own. And I think that can be a really strong attribute for the Xbox Series X if they're able to get these games out in a timely manner.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I agree, man. Like, I think that in the old Microsoft, the one we were just talking about, they took a lot of risks, and with the Xbox One, they were very risk averse at that point. They just didn't want to know anything about anything like that. Now it seems like Spencer is making some moves, and they are taking some gambles. They're taking some risks again. I really respect that and appreciate that. I mean, I love the Xbox original because it was such a unique, different system at the time, and it had all these cool games that you couldn't get on the PlayStation, like Jet Set Radio Future and stuff like that. And hopefully we can get back to something like that with the Series X, you know.
Bloodwake 2. Bloodwake 2.
Bloodwake 2, yeah, absolutely.
But like, yeah, it was amazing how on the original Xbox, how much Microsoft went to Sega
Yep.
for a game like Shenmue 2,
Yeah,
Panzer Dragoon Orta.
Yeah.
a lot of people don't realize there's probably about 200 exclusive Xbox games that came out on that system that you can't get anywhere else. I mean, obviously now a lot of them have been brought forward and some have been remade and things like that. But at the time, it's a lot bigger than you think when you think about the original Xbox.
Ninja Gaiden Black.
Yeah.
Like, Microsoft was an aggressive company on the original Xbox, and they started on the 360, and they lost their way in a post-Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare world. They leaned so heavily on the Western support, and they did it again on the Xbox One, and it just feels like they're going to go back to their...
Plus the Kinect stuff in there as well. And
yeah.
also you got to, you know, if you look at that generation and the 360 generation, that was when Japan struggled a lot with development.
True.
There was a lot of issues there with Japanese studios. I mean, some of them really pulled it off. Capcom and their MT framework was phenomenal, but it was a slow period. Japan kind of reemerged this generation back to where they should be, or at least where they were in the past, kind of. So, you know, and I know Phil Spencer loves Japanese games, so I'm sure he's very eager to get some more of those on Xbox as well, but we'll see what happens. So this could be interesting. I would like to see them go back to that early 360 original Xbox kind of attitude.
Yeah, we've seen Spencer bear fruit of his Japanese travels. Like, we have the Yakuza games are on Game Pass right now.
Yep.
And
That's
I mean,
true.
those were games that Sega was saying, I believe only a couple of years ago, they had no plans to bring to the Xbox, and all of a sudden they're on Game Pass. So it really makes you wonder, what does the future hold in terms of Japanese support for the Xbox Series X?
Because Phantasy Star Online too.
Yes,
as well.
I mean, and they had Square with Kingdom Hearts 3.
Yes.
And if they can get Final Fantasy 7 remake over, you know, after the PS4 exclusivity period ends, I think people really have to pay attention a little more to Microsoft here. But I mean, Sony still has that first party advantage. But if Microsoft can come out and leverage those IPs that they've been sitting on, whether they're rare IPs or they create some brand new IPs, I do feel like the Series X is the rebirth of the Xbox brand.
And I hope PlayStation, though, also... So I feel like they've lost a little something over the course of this generation. They're still producing amazing first-party games, but they've kind of settled on this sort of action-adventure style game, right? And along the way, they've shut down a lot of studios. Like, Sony used to have such a huge arm in the UK, especially. Some amazing talent over there producing just wonderful games, especially racing games and all kinds of other stuff. And all of that stuff seems to have been just pushed away. They shut it all down. There's not much over there other than, you know, Media Molecule's still there doing Dreams, which is amazing. But, you know, compared to where they were at the start of the PS4 generation or in PS3, they don't have quite the variety of first party titles. Maybe, I guess Japan Studio and all the people working under there might still produce some of that unique content, but it does feel like they've really kind of focused on a select number of developers under their umbrella now.
They definitely feel more of I'll use this term, they're more American focused with
Exactly,
what we're seeing
yeah.
from their software. Like, I mean, we have The Last of Us, we're going to see, you know, Spider-Man, we see Horizon come from Guerrilla, but when you lose the studios like Liverpool, who would produce the Wipeout games.
That's exactly what I was thinking of. And also Evolution Studios, Drive Club, like, it had issues, but it's an amazing game, and so were the MotorStorm games.
Oh, MotorStorm was a fun franchise, and then I believe the last entry was MotorStorm Apocalypse, and I think didn't that come around the same time as the earthquake in Japan?
So not only did that come around during the earthquake, it also released during that massive PSN outage.
Yes, just like SOCOM 4.
Yeah, I remember I spoke to some of the guys that worked on this when I did that video on Onrush.
Uh-huh.
And it was all the Evolution Studios guys, and it's like it sounds like the impact that had on them must have just been insane. You know, you're working on this game for so long, you're getting ready to release it, and all of a sudden these things start happening. You're just like, I mean, what do you do? That's really
Yeah.
bad.
Talk about like a perfect storm of what
Exactly.
can go wrong, did go wrong for them there.
It's just a shame because it's a great game nonetheless.
It is a great game. But yeah, I do hope Sony is able to dive into a little more of that like creativity. Because like I love like the Ratchet and Clank series. And we only got the reboot from
Yeah.
Insomniac this gen.
Although from Japan we did get the absolutely stellar Astrobot, which is one
True.
of this is possibly the best VR platformer that's ever
Yes.
been made. It's really good. So
It is a good game,
there is still stuff like that coming out.
definitely.
So it's definitely like right now my focus is definitely on Microsoft. I feel like they're going to be the ones who take a gamble in terms of software development this generation because they know they have to. And I fear that that arrogant Sony persona is going to come out and they're going to play it a little safe. Like we're going to get the Horizon 2 sequel, we're going to get another God of War, we're going to get another Spider-Man.
Is that
And
really that? But hold on, Nate. Is that safe, or is Microsoft coming out with the Series X? We'll say holiday this year with no exclusives, but you get Game Pass for 3 months for free. Which one's more safer? I think that's a safer option than Sony.
oh, in a way, yes, I do agree with you. But at the same time, if I'm Microsoft and I'm launching with no exclusives and I'm giving you Game Pass for 3 months, isn't that a gamble in and of itself? I'm launching with essentially nothing, and
Yeah,
I'm still trying to sell you on this hardware. Like I do think backwards compatibility is going to be a huge thing for Microsoft this gen, especially in contrast to Sony, who seems kind of non-committed.
yeah. Well, I mean, I definitely agree on the non-committing part. It seems like they've just stumbled,
Hmm.
pretty much the whole year. But I do think Sony has a a platform still where they can show the hardware from a consumer perspective, not from a GDC conference perspective, and really win back. I
Yeah.
guess some. I'm not. They haven't lost any fans, but just really win
No.
back confidence from a
Right.
consumer perspective.
I guess it comes down to whether or not, let's say Microsoft, they show some of their software, and let's just say a hypothetical, they come out, they show a new Forza game it's using ray tracing. It's near photorealistic. It looks amazing. They come out, they announce a Perfect Dark. They give us a teaser trailer. That'll get some fans excited. They show a complete reboot of the Fable franchise, where it's almost something like The Witcher 3, but it has dragons and some whimsicalness to it. And then they show us a amazing gameplay demonstration of Halo Infinite
Mhm.
using ray tracing, taking advantage of the SSD in full, where they're just going through this whole massive world. There are no load times, there is no pop in. And then they're saying Halo Infinite's launching, we'll say October of this year with the Xbox Series X.
Right.
That that might be enough for people to say, wow, Halo finally evolved.
Yeah, I mean, if that happens, and trust me, I welcome that. I want that to happen. Then Microsoft has is coming out next generation, swinging all guns blazing. I mean, I that's what I want to see happen.
Hmm. I mean, that's
Yeah,
that's
for
my
sure.
hopes.
We still don't know what Sony's going to have lined up for launch either. So, I mean, last time they had games like Killzone Shadowfall, which maybe not reflected upon in the most positive light looking back, even though I think it's a solid game. It was an absolute technical showpiece.
Oh, visually, it's
So,
still impressive.
yeah, like they had some big things like that ready to go at launch. And they also had smaller stuff like Resogun, which is
Yeah,
a really
Resogun
cool
was
indie game that
great.
looks great. So, but that's why we have to wait for this big Sony reveal to
Yes.
see, like, because we just don't know. We know nothing about what they have on the software side.
Do you
That's
think they're ready?
true.
Do you think both Microsoft and Sony are ready, or do you think this is more of a we have to do this now versus
Mm.
are we actually ready to release this stuff?
I mean, I can't speak to Sony because we just don't know enough. It's
Yeah.
hard to gauge. But having visited Microsoft, it does really feel like they've been working towards this for a long time. They do. It seems very ready, like they're ready to go in hard.
Hmm.
So I think that they are definitely ready. PS5, they absolutely could be ready as well. We just don't know because
Yep.
again, it's really hard to know what's going on in there. There's just not enough information there. So
So if you were Phil Spencer, what would be your focus for your upcoming events where you have to sell the Xbox Series X to the mass consumer? Like, what game would you show and what features would you highlight to make people say, wow, I never bought an Xbox before, but I'm buying a Series X?
I think they've talked a lot about the hardware already. I think that's out
Hmm.
there. I think what they need to do is they need to come out swinging with some very big games that show what this offers over previous gen. And they need to do it can be a mix of new stuff, but I really think something like Halo Infinite, it needs to be good, it needs to look amazing, and it needs to be shown. I think that's the kind of thing that actually gets fans of the platform excited again, and that's kind of what they're waiting for. So they need a moment like that. But like you said, showing something like Fable 4, and what it could conceivably be. Maybe it's not ready to be shown, but that's the kind of stuff, big stuff like that. They really need to get out there, and they need to get it out there fast. Because the last two conferences at E3, they were very entertaining, but they didn't. There wasn't anything that was quite that powerful, especially last year.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Nothing
Hmm.
where you're like, whoa, and that's something Sony was always really good with at their E3 conferences, was just like knocking it out of the park with at least one or two like really jaw-dropping demos or something unexpected.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah, yeah,
Microsoft need that really bad for on the software side because I think people
yeah.
are excited about the hardware, but they need that software.
And that's like Sony had the E3 of Dreams, where you had The Last
Yeah,
Guardian, Final Fantasy, and like Shenmue. And Microsoft had, I'd say they consistently had solid E3s throughout the Xbox One generation. They just never had that showcase that you walked away from saying, wow, I need to get an Xbox. It was just consistently quality, but that nothing groundbreaking. Like we've seen the Ori franchise. They're great games. You saw
oh yeah,
Cuphead, a fantastic game, but they weren't system sellers. Whereas Sony would come out in 2017, show you a roadmap of their next 3 years of big releases, and that was enough. Like, yeah, you're not getting these games for 3 to 4 years, but they got you excited today, and you bought a PlayStation for them, and you kept buying PlayStations moving forward, and that was enough. Whereas Microsoft was just always kind of like they always left you waiting. Like you guys have to have something big, something big is coming from you, right? And it just never seemed to come to fruition.
yeah. That's kind of the thing. I feel like they never had a demo as impactful as the Halo 2 demo from 2004. That was
Yep.
like
Ooh.
the best moment in Xbox E3 history in my memory. Where, even though the final game didn't end up looking quite like that, and we've seen builds of that version running on Xbox hardware, it was a legit thing. It was just very early, and but still, the way that whole reveal went was absolutely nuts. It really brought
Yeah,
down the house.
yeah.
Yep.
People went crazy for it. I mean, I think my big moment for Microsoft at like an E3 was probably when they showcased Gears of War, because that game to me was that set next gen.
See, I'm split on that because it looked insane when it released, but the earliest demos before they really nailed the gameplay loop had a lot of weirdness going on. Like you'd
Like
have
the
scenes of
car, that was like a
well,
big
there was the
draw.
car that was cool with the shadows because the
That was
early
cool.
versions they had full dynamic shadows, which was cool. But even
Yeah.
earlier than that, when they very first showed the game, you'd have like Marcus Phoenix just running across a battlefield, just taking tons and tons of bullets, and he's just kind of like ooh, 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 like flinching in a very uh not so elegant looking way. And it just made it seem like you're just like, what, you're just taking all these bullets and he's just reacting this way, and like what's even the gameplay, and can Epic even make a single player game like this anymore? There was a lot of like, confusion around it at that time. For me at least, I remember being like skeptical. But then when it came out, it was,
Yeah. like yeah, Gears to me was like that game that really set the 360 apart from the Xbox, because you remember the early days of the 360 where we had Wall Guy and everyone was calling it an Xbox 1.5
But then
because
we had Graw.
Yeah.
and
Graw.
and Fight Night Round 3.
Oh, that game was great.
Oh yeah,
remember
that's stunning.
When I saw that for the first time, I was like, wow.
And it looks better on 360 than it does on PS3.
I agree.
That's
I agree with John. All roads lead to Halo Infinite. If Halo Infinite is there at launch, Series X is in a good place. I think. How do you sell the Series X to people? I think if you have Halo Infinite and you really push that, and then you also market the, hey, you can bring any of your old or of your existing Xbox One games across, no problem at all. They'll all work. That's also a huge selling point. And of course, hey, by the way, we have these really cool things called Game Pass and xCloud where you can play these games instantaneously without any type of loading or waiting for patches available today. And you get 3 months of it for free when you buy a Series X. I think those are the three kind of things that will really sell the Series X. And if they can execute on those, which I think they will, then I think the system is in really good shape.
Definitely.
So to conclude this, on a scale of 1 to 100, what would you say is your confidence rating in Microsoft doing well with the Series X?
I'm gonna go with 87.93 repeating.
I'm going to go a little lower, not much though, a little lower because I'm just that skeptic that has, John, I've told this to Nate before, but I just have difficulty believing that Halo Infinite will be ready for launch. But that's another conversation for another episode. But
Yeah,
I
I'm worried about that too.
I think so. With that in mind, my level is probably like an 82.
An 82.
Yeah.
All right, I'll split the difference and come in at an 85. And I mean, we have to wait for that, that showcase, see what Microsoft has in store from us. I'm excited to see what they have. Hopefully they don't pull a Don Matrick and fall over their own feet and show us Halo Infinite and somehow the game is hardly a Halo game or some weird decision. But that will conclude today's episode. I want to thank John for joining us today.
Oh, of course. And if I had to give a grade to Sony, I'd probably say it's more about 91%.
Ooh,
There you
coming
go.
in high with the Sony confidence. And MVG, always a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me on. And I would give Sony, again, I'd go a little lower than that. I'd probably give it like an 85.
It's just that hype, man. The hype is huge.
It is.
Like even like maybe it'll tail off, but right away it's gonna smash. I know it's gonna do well.
That logo and that controller got people excited.
Exactly. That's what I'm basing that kind of stuff, and just the engagement with our own audience. It's
Yep.
insane.
Oh, to everyone, if you enjoyed this episode, give the video a like. If you didn't like it, give it a dislike. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll be sure to go through them. You can find a link to John's Twitter account and to Digital Foundry's YouTube channel in the description below, as well as MVG's YouTube account. And until next time, don't deny me, embrace me.